Well, I think that it is something where, I think economies around the world are waking up a little bit to, what is the industrial future of our economies? I think that we have enjoyed, 20 years of globalization where, we got goods around the world, there was a lot of trade, but people are also thinking a little bit around what does that do with my industrial future? And I think that, it happens in Europe, I think it happens in the US, I think that Asian countries as well, we're all thinking about it. What can we do? I think that we all need to, for previous generations, I think that it was very much around relying on, a world where globalization was the norm. I think that we're now going into a world where there needs to be, win-win among different countries, even as we think about trade, right? So with all this discussion, trade has actually gone up in the last few years. It's just that the trade patterns have changed, right? So I think that, for example, you see right now there's more south-to-south trade. I think, like for example, from China, our biggest trading partner now is ASEAN, right? There's a lot more trading between China and, let's say, Mexico. There's more trading between China and Latin America. So I think that some trade patterns are changing. It's no longer just manufacturing in the East, consumption in the West. I think we're going into a much more of a more complicated, more nuanced world where every country needs to think a little bit around what's in it for me, but also be very sensitive around what's in it for others and make sure that there are win-win solutions.
I don't know if you followed the speech and what's your key takeaways?
I think the speech was good. I think the speech was very consistent. And in our world today, God knows that we need more consistency around. And I think that, China's stance has always been, we are going into a period where we're looking at 4 to 5% GDP growth. That is still 30% of global GDP growth. So it's a fundamental building block of growth in the world, which is very important. And that's China's contribution. But at the same time, we would like to make sure that there are good trade and around countries. We would want to make sure that there's less protectionism as much as possible. And I think there's also a stage where Chinese companies, Chinese enterprises will have to think a little bit more around being global companies, right, and engage more of the world. So I think China also wants to engage more of the world and become, I think from a factory of the world to becoming more, multinational companies for the world. I think the first thing I would say is that GDP growth at 4%, 5% is not actually that low. If you think about mature markets, they've been growing at 2% a year for a very, very long time. And right now we're growing at 4 to 5%. I think that that's still very reasonable growth. But for business leaders, what we need to do is to make sure that we understand the reality and have our expectations in the right place. In the past, I think Chinese companies have been too much of thinking ahead, right? Let's build more factories, let's build more capacity, let's build more supply even before the demand, because we always take for granted that the demand will be there, if not in China, in other places. I think right now, there's a lot more, I would say, precision needed in our planning, in thinking around what segments we want to play in thinking around how do we become more of a global citizen. So I do think that for Chinese companies, it's very important to grow into a mindset where the winning formula in the last 20 years was about getting there first, getting to scale early, was trying to figure out how do I get more capacity, get more people, have more employees. Yeah. I think the future is going to be, how do I become, a more savvy, more nuanced, right? Become a bit more precise around, segments, right? Customers. And I think that insights, it's going to be something where Chinese companies need to become more sophisticated. The bar is rising for Chinese companies to grow. And I think that, the Chinese, companies have a lot to learn as well. I give you one example. I think before Chinese companies, what they thought about was, as long as I can manufacture something in China that's great value for money, make it the cheapest, the most efficient, the rest of the world will buy from me. It's not so simple anymore. We need to go to different places and figure out, okay, how can I become a good corporate citizen? How do I help your employment situation? How do I fit into your industrial policies? How can I add value to your country? Not only by giving you cheap goods, but also giving you something that also raises the prospects for your young people. So I do think that for Chinese companies, the geopolitics, a little bit more, for each country, the culture, what they're looking for, how do we fit into their plans? I think there's a much more sophisticated way to think about the world. And I think that for us, and for Chinese companies, that's something that we have to learn and get better at. And I think that Chinese companies are fast learners, right? So we figure out that, okay, right, so there's a new formula for success. How do I think about it, right? So, you see that right now, a lot of the Chinese companies are thinking around, you have technology, you have IP, you have brands, you have innovation. How do I leverage these, but also make sure that, I leave some wins for local companies, for partners. I think joint ventures are very interesting for Chinese companies. I think that we have to learn how to be great joint venture partners. I think we have to learn how to think about, collaboration with others. So I do think that you talk about electric vehicles. I think there's a ripe industry where that kind of formula, right, will need to happen, because a lot of these countries, they also want to see their own EV industry being built, not only yours. I think that is going to be what I call a more sophisticated way to do global business.
How do you think Chinese company and businesses could play an active role in?
Yeah, I think the Chinese businesses are actually very digital. In my opinion, I think Chinese businesses are probably more digital than most businesses around the world, because a lot of us, had our biggest growth phase during the digital and the mobile digital age in China. So how do you work with, digital consumers? How do you think about direct-to-consumer plays? I think that's really in Chinese companies' DNA. So I think the digital side is well established. I think the question is how to collaborate. I think that there needs to be a little bit more win-win. There needs to be a little bit more collaboration. There needs to be a little bit more, how do I ensure that everyone around me also will enjoy some success because of me? I think that's also important. And that, including in the industry itself, I think the competition, I think that we also need to figure out how to win as an industry, not just win as me and everyone else will suffer because of my dominance. I think that thinking needs to be a little bit more nuanced, right, as we move into the next few years.
And what kind of feedbacks do you hear mostly from them regarding doing business with China?
I think doing business with China, has always been something on top of people's mind. China as a end, consumption market, or China as a supply chain to your global business. So I've talked to a lot of large CEOs of big multinational companies, and for them, China is always going to be a very important topic on the agenda. Is business tougher these days? Of course it is, right? Has profitability in China been a little bit more challenging in the last few years? Of course it is, right? So all of us are trying to figure out, okay, in this, medium growth era of China, how do we need to transform ourselves, right, to this new reality? And I think that for a lot of companies, right, in the past, it was around participation, right, in a high growth market. It was around trying to get more distribution. It was trying to get more exposure. It was trying to grow. But I think that right now, I think we're moving into something that's a little bit more mature, right? So therefore, people need to pick their battles. People need to be a little bit, it's not only growth, right? It's around our own business model. It's around what segments do we play. It's a little bit around how more sophisticated we need to be around, the product design and innovation. Cost, in the past, I think companies were just, they just needed to, in China, there's no concept of the COO, the Chief Operating Officer. In the past, there's only the business leader, and then I go get the business, and you guys just do it, okay? But now, in a more mature setting, it's around how do I operate in a way that's actually more efficient? How do I make sure that my costs are lowering every year? So many of these things where I think in mature markets we have seen, in many years, I think we're now seeing it in China. So I think for what I am seeing here in Davos is that a lot of business leaders are now looking at the next stage of Chinese growth in the China market and trying to figure out, okay, how do I need to pivot? How do I need to transform? And how do I need to make sure that my old formula needs to be adjusted so that I can continue to succeed in this new economic era?